Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to another episode of As I Live and Grieve. Again, I am so grateful for those of you who tune in, who download the podcast, who listen in. And again, and I say it every week, I know, but it's always true. I have a really great guest today, and I think you're really going to feel inspired, uplifted, and supported. So join me as I welcome Clarissa Maul. Clarissa, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. My honor, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Before we get started with my questions, of which I always have plenty, would you just share a little bit of your background with our listeners and let them know who is Clarissa?
Sure. Well, for many years, I would have described myself as a homeschooling mom and a wife and a mother. I worked part-time as a communications consultant while schooling my kids. My husband, Rob, and I were married for 17 years and had a really joyful and imperfect life. It was a good one.
Mm-hmm.
In 2019, on our family vacation, Rob died in a hiking accident, leaving me a widow now with 4 young children to raise by myself.
Very suddenly.
Yes. And so when I think of myself, when I think of who I am now, I think of both the before his death and then the after his death. It's been 5 years since he died, and I'm now a remarried widow, blended family of 9. It's a loud and crazy, chaotic life, but it is a joyful one. And I'm grateful both for the love of my first husband and the love of my second, through the love that lasts beyond the grave. And I also work in bereavement advocacy. So my life has shifted very dramatically. And now I work with folks who are grieving because I know what it's like. I know what it's like to lose someone that you love and have to rebuild your life.
Yeah, it's like no other experience ever. I know my husband, Tom, has been gone for, 6.5 years. It'll be 7 years next March. And though I've had other losses in my life, both my mom, my dad, and an infant son, losing my spouse, losing Tom, was like no other loss in my life. And it takes a while. It's unique for everyone. And it just takes a while for you to kind of find yourself again and redefine yourself. Now, in my experience, when Tom died, I did not have children living with me at home. I was by myself. So one of the things I'm interested in, could you tell us, Clarissa, how old were your children and what were those first few days like for you and your children?
Well, my youngest had just turned 7 and my oldest was 13 on the cusp of turning 14. So they were young. Yeah. And, I think when you experience sudden loss, there's a lot of shock that comes along with that. There is a sense of denial, like I must be living in a nightmare and this can't be real. Surely I will wake up at some point. And I'm sure if you talk to all of us back then, we would have expressed those things. Yeah. And I've come to realize that disbelief is kind of a mercy. Right. Our bodies, our hearts, our minds couldn't take all of the expansiveness of that loss in a moment. And so I think to some extent that numbness, that shock, it is a mercy. We're slowly exposed to the reality of our person's death. Now, eventually it wears off, and like Novocaine wearing off after a dental procedure, it's pretty raw.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that is the experience of sudden loss that I find most folks have, is that feeling of what has just happened to me.
Right. And what was it like for you personally? Because you're grieving this sudden and unanticipated loss of your husband, your spouse, the person who chose you and you chose him to live your lives out and enjoy your families. So you're grieving that loss, yet your children are grieving the loss of their dad. So you're trying to help them. So you're also grieving for your children's grief, so to speak. So what was that like for you?
Very true. Yeah, you watch your children and it's amazing. We as parents, I often talk to parents and this thought resonates, we could let all kinds of bad things happen to us and we could survive it, but
Yeah.
please don't let anything happen to my
Yes.
child,
Yes.
right? And so there's an extent to which watching your children grieve is even more painful than bearing your own grief.
Mm-hmm.
And so, part of that is realizing that even though we experience a shared loss, we're all going to experience it very differently. And so part of my personal work was not projecting my grief upon them.
Right.
Children grieve in a very different way than adults do.
Mm-hmm.
Adolescents grieve in a very different way than children do.
Right.
And so a big part of my parenting through grief was learning to be a student of each child. Like, what does this child need? Where are they feeling the ache of loss? Where are they not? Where do I see growth in them? Where do I see particular tenderness that needs to be attended to? It really is a posture of curious observation, I think, for most parents as they're trying to figure out how to care for their children best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, as I understand it from looking at your website and everything, you are very, very strong in your faith.
Mm-hmm.
Did that help you? And how?
Yes, I think that my faith is part of how I survived. I think that for a lot of people, death presents them with deep soul level questions that maybe they've never interacted with before. Is there a God? Why do bad things happen to good people? Is there an afterlife? Questions like that. And if you're a person of faith, then you may already have sort of textbook answers to those things.
Okay.
And you come to that reality of loss where the rubber meets the road and you have to say, do I actually believe these things or do I not? For me, that moment was not a moment of crisis, but a moment of confirmation where I was able to lean into my Christian faith and say, yes, these are the things I do believe and I take comfort in them. And in as much as I say that, I want to honor the fact that for many people, those deep existential questions become a crisis of faith.
Right.
And that's okay. That's okay. I think a lot of people, they want to believe in things like angels or heaven or the afterlife, and they want to think of those things as like a Band-Aid for the pain. And the reality is that faith is never a salve to that wound. Grief is very deep. And even if you have deep beliefs, those things aren't going to take away the pain, but they will help you interpret it perhaps and bring meaning to that experience.
Oh, that's very well expressed. And did your faith help your children? Were you able to kind of carry that over, so to speak, and help them in their own faith in whatever they believed at their ages?
Yeah, I think that for each of us, it was about engaging in conversation. You know, does Dad's death bring up questions for you? How do we sit with those questions? Are there answers to those questions, or are these things that we have to sort of release because they are unknowable? I think a lot of loss presents us with our own acceptance of mystery. You know, whether that is, why did my person get cancer and this person didn't? Why did this treatment work for this person and it didn't work for my person? And we're not left with concrete answers. Why did my husband, who was a conscientious hiker, die? He had always done everything right. And we don't get to answer those questions many times. And I think when we're guiding children through loss, there is a level of honesty that we have to bring to those conversations where we say, hey, kids, I don't know. We may not get those answers. And if we can't get those answers, if faith can't support us in those places, how are we going to live? How are we going to release our need for certainty, our need to know, and live hopefully in the midst of a world that really has a lot of unknowns?
Yeah. And were your kids challenged by this fact that there were questions that would never be answered?
I'm sure. Yeah. You know, we all wrestle with that.
Yeah.
Right. And kids, most of their life is concrete yes or no. You know, it's that kind of thing of,
sure,
if mom doesn't say yes, go ask dad because he might say yes. Right?
Absolutely.
And so they're accustomed to concrete realities, but we adults know there's a lot of abstraction in life. There's a lot of unknown. And so they gain wisdom beyond their years, I think, when children lose a loved one early in life.
Yeah. I like what you said before, that you kind of became a student to see what your kids needed. Where did you kind of get that idea, that concept to do that?
Well, I'm a career teacher. I taught at the college level for a long time. I have taught in middle school. I've taught high school courses. And, just formulating lesson plans over the years, you realize that in as much as I wish to deliver information to my students, I have to kind of know where they're at to know what information to offer and when. And so a teacher who has taught for a long time knows that you may show up with your syllabus and your lesson plan. But if the students are struggling, if they don't understand a concept, you're going to have to slow down. You're going to have to repeat yourself. You're going to have to adjust to where the students are at. And so I think I found that I just applied those sort of teaching principles that I had used in the classroom to my own family when lost.
All right. And can you tell our listeners, can you clarify for them maybe some lessons, so to speak, that you learned from your children, and especially representative of their different ages?
Well, when I think about my youngest, who was in that very solidly in that early childhood age range when her dad died, I think the thing I learned most from her was to talk in concrete language. When she was young, she asked questions like, what is cremation? And rather than talk around it or use euphemisms, it was important to, in age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate language, explain what was happening. What did burial mean? What was a funeral? Those kind of questions were important to ask. And so we used words like death and died and dying. We didn't use passed away or lost, because we wanted to be really clear about what had happened for her sake. When I think about my middle-aged children, I think that honoring their questions about how were very important. So how am I going to get to school now? How are we going to pay to live in our house? Do we have enough money for groceries? Are you going to need to go back to work? They're very, as an older student, ages 12 to 15, they're interested in the logistics part of that. What does it mean? And I realized that was important to talk with them about. And then for my emerging teenager, it was those long range questions. It was sitting with the mystery of the why questions we can't answer, and then honoring that she was looking to the future. Dad won't be there when I graduate from high school. He won't be there to walk me down the aisle. And being able to sit in honest grief about those things that we now knew would never come to be.
And how do they resonate now with the new family?
Well, it's its own kind of loss. I think it's something that folks don't talk a lot about when they talk about blended families. They look at us and they say, oh, it's the Brady Bunch. It's all so happy. And we don't have an Alice who lives with us. Sure wish we did. But, one thing that's important for folks to understand about blended families, particularly after the death of a parent, but also after divorce, is that there's a deep sense of loss. And it's something that is constantly being reckoned with. So in as much as there is joy and there's change and it's beautiful, there's also an abiding sense of loss for the family that could never be, loss for all of those milestones where that parent won't be there. I'm not a replacement for my stepchildren's mother, and my husband isn't a replacement for my kid's dad. And I think it's helpful to remember that grief continues even after a good thing like a second marriage comes to be.
Do you have different times, holidays or anniversaries or something where you remember the parent who has died for the sake of the children?
That's a really interesting question. And early on, that was very important to us as a family. We would celebrate Dia de los Muertos in the fall. And set up an ofrenda with pictures and eat foods my husband loved. We would celebrate his birthday with a cake. But as time went on, the kids didn't want to do that anymore. And so what I found is that as they have grown up, as they have emerged into their own understanding of what their loss means, the remembrances are far more frequent, but far more subtle. So it's about storytelling in the car, an impromptu dessert night. It's less programmatic, but it's still very much significant.
Is it more based on memories now, those memories that make you smile?
Yes, very much, very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, I love those memories. It's quite different when you reach that point in grief where you have specifically the memories that make you smile and
Yes,
not the memories that remind you of the loss as much.
that's so true.
It's a way of keeping them with you.
Hmm.
So obviously, it sounds like you were very successful, even though I know there were challenges with your chhallenges and everything, many, many challenges. But have you written a parenting book? If someone is not a teacher and doesn't have that concept of seeing what your children need and everything, what can you suggest for other moms or dads who have suffered the death of their spouse or partner or significant other and now have the children to help? What do you suggest for them?
Well, if you have younger children, and really if you are interfacing at all with children of any age, I highly recommend the Dougie Center. The Dougie Center is a center for families with grieving children. They provide so many resources on their website, resources for teachers, resources for youth leaders and parents at every developmental stage and age. It's a wonderful resource that I have relied on many times. And I point school counselors in their direction. I point Sunday school teachers in their direction. I point parents in their direction. The Dougie Center is really the premier resource for families and adults who are interfacing with children. And then, of course, for teenagers, it's a little bit complicated because teenagers don't like to talk to adults about big feelings.
They don't like they don't like to talk to any adult at all.
That's right. And so I think the approach with teenagers needs to be a little bit different. It needs to be heavily relational. And that's why my daughter Fiona and I wrote Hurt, Help, Hope, our book that's coming out in October, because we saw that need for deep relationship and we wanted to create a starting point, a model for teens specifically to have those relationships with adults in their lives.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about that book and what it was like to write with your daughter. That must be wonderful.
Oh, it was lots of fun. Fiona is a great writer, a great human, and she's a very good editor too. There were moments where she would say, "You can't say that, Mom, that's cheesy." So to cut it out. But she is in college now and she has grown up with loss. And so it was an honor to think through the questions that teens ask about grief and loss and life after loss, to figure out how we wanted to answer those things, to talk in community with therapists and school chaplains and hospice volunteers about the questions they were receiving from teens and to talk to teens also. So this partnership that Fiona and I had over the months of writing this book was a really beautiful one and really, I think, enhanced our communication as we sort of parsed out what our loss had looked like for us over the years where I was parenting her through adolescence and into adulthood.
Can you give us a sample maybe of a question that, say, a 7-year-old might ask, maybe a 12-year-old might ask, and then maybe a 16-year-old might ask?
Sure. So a 7-year-old might ask, can grandma breathe underground?
Okay.
That's a very concrete question. It's a very common one.
Just gave me chills, actually.
and that's what it does, doesn't it? Like a knife to the heart, because we don't want to have to think that our child is thinking those things. But it's a real question, right?
Sure.
And so it's good to be able to answer that question. A question a 12-year-old might ask would be, do you think I could get cancer too?
Okay.
So that's a relational kind of question.
Right.
They know that people who are sick can die, and they wonder, if I have a cough, if I have a fever, does that mean that I will get sick and die?
Right.
A question that a 16 or a 17-year-old might ask would be, why can't my friends just treat me like I'm normal? And that's a lot harder of a question.
Yeah, yes, it is. All right. So now would you honor us by answering those questions?
Well, to the 7-year-old, I would say grandma doesn't need to breathe underground because her body has closed down. It's kind of like at night when we turn off the lights and we lock the doors and close them. When a person's body dies, all of its functions close down. its heart stops beating, its lungs stop breathing. And so eventually the body turns to dust again, just like the dirt outside the backyard. So we can be reassured that grandma she's not having trouble breathing underground.
Okay.
To the 12-year-old, let's see, how would I answer that question? I might tell the 12-year-old, I would say, I'm so glad that we have helpers who keep us healthy and safe. And if I'm ever concerned that you might get sicker, we will go right to the doctor to learn more and get the care that you need.
Okay.
And then I would say to the 16, 17, 8-year-old, I would say, a lot of people don't know how to face loss. A lot of adults aren't good at it either.
Right.
I wonder if we could sit down together and talk about some of the things that are specifically hard at school and some ways that we could come to solutions together.
Oh, you're really good at this. You're good at those questions, but you're also really good at those on the spot questions. Because I did just put you on the spot.
You did, yes.
But I so appreciate it. Wow, you have offered so much information that I would hope in the next few minutes, when I allow you some time to talk directly to the listeners, that you invite the listeners to reach out to you, to read your books, things like that. Because, boy, if I were a parent with children and were grieving myself and they were grieving, I would certainly want to reach out to you, Clarissa, because I think you hold so many keys. And I would also be looking for that Dougie Center as well. You have given us so much hope, I think, because dealing with children and the topic of grief is a really tough one. And when you're grieving yourself, it's something that it's difficult to find strength to do. It truly is. So having said that, and as our time winds down a little bit, I do want to turn the microphone over to you and let you speak directly to our listeners. Let them know about all of the books you've written, about the book coming out. By the time this podcast airs, it will be out, so people can hurry up and go right to Amazon and get it. I myself am going to grab a copy of that and have it just for the knowledge. I want to read what you and Fiona have created together. So this is your turn. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for this conversation. I am particularly excited about our new book, Hurt, Help, Hope, a real conversation about teen grief and life after loss. We know that 1 in 13 students in the U.S. will lose a parent or a sibling before they turn 18. We know that COVID deaths in the last couple of years mean that at least 5 to 7 family members were affected by every single death. That's a lot of grieving kids.
It is.
We know that the Surgeon General's report on student mental health is pretty bleak. We know that we've got a lot of hurting students among us. And so for anyone who interfaces with adults or with teenagers, any teenagers who are in need of care, Hurt, Help, Hope is the beginning conversation to having those tough conversations about grief and loss. We have formatted it in a question and answer format to sort of model the discourse we hope that students will be able to have, understanding that for a lot of teens, talking to an adult is really hard. And so we hope that this book is something that can be a gift to a hurting teen. Hey, you know what? This is something I think might be helpful for you. You can underline it and highlight it and dog ear it and stick it under their pillow and use it when they need to. They can hop around to the questions that they need answering and return to it as they need to. We knew that students do something called re-grieving over time, that with each developmental milestone, they experience their loss in new ways with the deepening understanding that comes with growing up. And so we know that this resource is going to be helpful when you're 12. It's probably also going to be helpful when you're 18. You may even need to return to it when you're 22, because that's just the normal developmental process of a child who's experienced loss. And so whether you've got questions about disrupted sleep patterns, or why am I not hungry anymore, or why do my friends not want to talk to me? What do I do at the holidays? Can I have hope? Am I depressed or am I grieving? These are the questions that we address in the book, and so many more. There are quizzes, there are self-assessments, lots of interactive tools. We've got playlists and movie recommendations.
Wow.
all kinds of things that we hope will be resources for students so that they have information at their fingertips. And like a really good buffet at the Old Country Buffet, they can select the meal that is most appropriate for where they're at. While it's a book directly for teenagers, we do hope that parents and coaches and youth leaders will take a look as well, read over their shoulder, so to speak, grab a copy so that when a student comes to them, they're prepared to have those conversations and feel informed.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. All right, I have a basic question. See, I still have questions. This particular book, and we have talked about grief as we usually do, as it pertains to the death of a parent, the death of a loved one. But grief can stem from other losses as well. It can be maybe parents have divorced, maybe your own relationship. Maybe this is the first boyfriend or girlfriend you had and that relationship fell apart. You can grieve those losses as well. Are these questions applicable in other instances of grief as well?
I think that's a fantastic question. And while the book is written specifically for those who are grieving the death of a loved one, you're right. Death comes in many forms. And I think the questions, particularly about emotions, about relationships, about physical experiences of loss, will be very, very applicable to something like a move or a job loss in a family that's really rocked your family, or a divorce. Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah. I know teens, and I have said many times in podcasts that knowing that grief can really stem from any loss at all, and the importance of said loss varies for every person and every instance. But I think it would be very difficult to find any person in the entire world who is not or has not grieved some loss, especially when you consider the pandemic that we went through, and we're still suffering losses from that pandemic. So grief, I think, is ever present in the world around us. And sometimes just by listening to a podcast, by picking up a book, and even just flipping through it, even if you don't focus and read verbatim and absorb it all, even just flipping through it and maybe going to this question or that question and reading answers, that we can not only help ourselves with our grief, but we can help the people around us. And I think it is so, so very important to do exactly that. Would you agree?
Oh, yes, definitely. We rise and fall together. And one of the things that you realize when you lose someone that you love is how valuable your community is to you.
Absolutely.
So, being educated is something that's worthwhile for all of us.
Yeah. And I advocate for self-care so many times because I use the silly analogy of being in a plane and they tell you if the oxygen masks
That's right.
drop down, put yours on first, because you can't help someone else unless you yourself are protected and saved. So that applies for any instance. And it's a silly analogy, but everyone relates to it. So, I want people to take care of themselves, and self-care can even mean the people you surround yourself with.
Very true.
That is a way of self-care. And if you do not have those people around you, try to find some, whether it's through a bereavement group, a church congregation, an association, a volunteer fire department, volunteering at a hospice home. Try to find those people somewhere, because that is a vital part of your self-care and your healing from grief. On that note, I think I'm going to say to the listeners, thank you again for tuning in. I hope you have found some inspiration in Clarissa's words, and I hope you will reach out to her. Her contact information will be in the podcast notes. And as always, I will say, if for some reason you can't find it, just send me a note and I will put you in touch with Clarissa. By all means, check for her book or books. But I think the one that she's written with her daughter, Fiona, and it's Hurt,
Help, Hope.
Hurt, Help, Hope. Thank you. Hurt, Help, Hope. So look for that. It will be new on the shelves. It also, I think, might make a great gift. Sometimes when a family has suffered a death, you wonder, I would like to do something, and I'd like to do something for those kids. Maybe a gift of this book might help those kids, and in the same way help the parents as well. So take care, everyone. Be good to yourselves. Practice self-care. Stay well as we all continue to live and grieve.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.